I'm Alan Atwood. Among other things, I am the editor of the Big Issue magazine, and very importantly, I am the one person on this stage who is not a barrister. It might have happened once. I did in fact start a law course, but the only reason I got into second year was, with all due respect to any legal educators here, I could not believe it would be as boring as first year. And it was. We're going to be chatting here tonight about human rights, their practice, their application, and also, importantly, we are going to be allowing lots of time for questions, in fact, a whole 25 minutes or so. Because apart from anything else, these people are barristers. They are very good at talking, and they are very, very good at answering questions.
What it means is we didn't prepare anything.
And Alan, I'm only a solicitor.
Well, I'm sure you can talk. I've got no doubt about that at all. Now, first of all, I should introduce our panellists, and I'm going to do this in strict alphabetical order. As someone who has the initials AA, I've always thought that's a very good idea. I suspect, actually, that I don't need terribly much by way of introduction, because I suspect you know these people very well. And I actually don't want to say too much about them, because I've discovered in reading a bit about them that they're the sort of people who very quickly make you feel like underachievers. First off, in the middle here, we have Julian Burnside QC. He's an Australian barrister who specialises in commercial litigation. His name, I think, is synonymous with cases such as Tampa and the waterfront. I should also say that anyone who saw the 2007 mini-series about the waterside dispute will know that Mr. Burnside does a very, very good Rhys Muldoon impression. To my left is Debbie Mortimer SC. She is a Melbourne barrister whose areas of practice include matters relating to civil liberties, constitutional law, discrimination law, equal opportunity, freedom of information, and of course human rights. She is also a Kiwi.
Which is a good thing.
On the far side, again, I'm sure...
On the extreme left, Alan.
Extreme left. I didn't say that. Robert Starry runs his own practice. He has been the president of the Criminal Defence Lawyers Association. Recently, he's bobbed up on your television sets and in your newspaper headlines representing people as diverse as Jack Thomas, the Tamil Tigers, G20 protesters, and also S11 protesters. He refuses to confirm or deny whether he is in fact the subject of the very popular Don McLean song Starry, Starry Night. I should say also that this event is presented by the Victorian Law Foundation in partnership with the Wheeler Centre as the evening launch event of Law Week, which is all across Victoria all week, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying everything to do with law is free or at least cut price this week. So anyone with any legal problems, this is your week. I'm sure that's right. Now, let's talk about human rights, and please remember that there will be time for questions afterwards. So if you have something you wish to address, either to one of the panellists individually or collectively, keep that question up your sleeve until later. My first question to each of you, in turn, starting again in alphabetical order. Human rights, their enshrinement, their protection, their neglect. Are we better off now than we were, say, 10, 20, 50 years ago? Julian, would you care to start?
I think the answer is no. I can't really remember what it was like 50 years ago. I'll have to defer to you, Alan.
Pass.
I think the problem in Australia is that we actually are very unsophisticated in our understanding of human rights, partly because Australians, for the most part, don't have their human rights threatened unless they happen to be in the margins, and it's a relatively small percentage of people. But it's always puzzled me. I think if you ask most Australians whether they think human rights matter, the overwhelming majority would say yes. And yet the large proportion of the community were unconcerned by the fact that David Hicks was kept locked up for years by our ally in appalling conditions without charge and without trial. I didn't notice any outcry at the idea of preventative detention or the idea of control orders. You know, Rob acted for Jack Thomas, who was the first person to get a control order put against him. The community at large didn't seem to think that there was anything odd about the fact that someone could be made the subject of a control order without being told what evidence was used against them in order to get the order. I didn't notice most of the population expressing much concern about the jailing of innocent men, women and children who'd done nothing worse than escape from the Taliban and come here asking for protection. Now, if we actually think human rights matter, how could we be indifferent to those things happening in our community? Yet the reality is that most Australians did not give a rat's about what was happening in those cases and many others that you can think of. So our problem is we're actually very unsophisticated about human rights. And I think it comes down to this. When people say, and they mean it, that human rights are important, they think their human rights are important. But they're not the least bit interested in the human rights of people they dislike or people that they fear. And it's only when you recognise that those people's human rights are just as important as your own that you understand what human rights are.
Debbie, same question for you.
Look, I think we're better off by and large in this, and it really depends on what you mean when you talk about human rights, because some of the examples that Julian has given are absolutely spot on. There are egregious things that happen every day in our community that people don't seem to care about. I mean, I would add to that list the intervention. I mean, how is it that an entire section of the Australian community can be treated by reason of their race as they are, have their social security benefits quarantined, have their houses invaded, have their communities invaded? How is that? And that the rest of the community can sit by and say, we think that's a good idea, only for those coloured people. So there are lots of things like that, but I think if you were to compare the situation 10, 15 years ago in terms of a lot of mainstream human rights issues. Now, don't forget, discrimination issues, sex discrimination issues, they are human rights issues. And if you compare where women are now to where they were 15 years ago, you know, we're better off. We're doing a lot better. We're getting there. So there are some issues that perhaps don't always get described as human rights issues because they've become so mainstream. We don't talk about them like that, but that's what they are. They are human rights issues, and we're better off. So we're better off in some ways, but I think in other ways, as Julian says, it's the situations where there are people that are very different from us, with whom we don't share either a common heritage or we don't share common experiences, and often we are afraid of them. And it's those people that we have difficulty recognising as entitled to the same treatment that we are.
Yeah, look, I'm not as optimistic as Deb is, I'm afraid. I think we have improved in some areas, for instance, rights of women and other minority groups having discrimination laws that protect their interests and whatnot. But I think there's been a fairly insidious development of power by the state against individuals, erosion of a presumption of innocence, removal of a right to silence. The fundamental cornerstones of our criminal justice system have all been interfered with, and we saw it really post 9/11 in the guise of anti-terrorism legislation, and talking to Julian backstage about this, whether there's been some sort of bracket creep effectively, where we've seen an adaptation of anti-terrorism legislation, for instance, in the Australian Building and Construction Commission, where workers who have not been charged with any offence in the building industry are compelled to coercively give answers to questions. They have no right to silence, having not committed any offence, face the risk of up to 6 months imprisonment. I think those sorts of things are quite insidious. The World Youth Day in Sydney, where exclusion zones were established, where people's rights to freedom of movement, freedom of association were all impinged upon. I think those things are quite insidious. Curiously, I was in Canberra 2 days ago, and the second biggest building that since the new Parliament House has been erected is the new ASIO building. They're on an employment campaign promotion. They're going to double their size. I know there's a lot of refugees they'll need to assess, but those sorts of things trouble me.
You mentioned power of the state, you mentioned the post-9/11 world. I'm interested in your reactions, all of you, on the recent events involving Osama bin Laden. Where do we stand vis-à-vis his human rights?
Well, I think it's pretty easy. He's a human being, or he was a human being. He was entitled to be treated the way other human beings are entitled. I was very offended by political leaders who came out and said he's been brought to justice. What extrajudicial slaying is justice? I mean, since when did assassination in a foreign country become justice? It's extraordinary.
I think the dust is yet to settle on how he was actually executed, whether he was unarmed, whether he used other persons in the room as a shield. The ground has shifted on all of those questions since his execution. But I think, Julian, we've also seen it, for instance, in our parliamentary leaders' comments about the execution of people like Van Nguyen and some of the Bali 9 people. Human life as a sacrosanct issue depends on whatever political whim of the day.
Not quite. It depends on who you're talking about. Executing the Bali 9 was regarded as a very bad idea. Executing the Bali bombers was regarded much more favourably. Executing Van Nguyen, no good. Executing Saddam Hussein, okay. Now we have this
I don't think that's a view shared by readers of the Herald Sun, for instance. If you look at the commentary, the Andrew Bolts of the world, you look at that sort of commentary, they would say the execution of Van Nguyen and the execution of the Bali 9 are a good thing.
Well, I was talking about political responses, actually, and not going right to the bottom of the barrel.
You've got more confidence in the in our parliamentarians than I have. But
we do know the politicians were all against the idea of executing the Bali 9. Although, remember, just before the 2007 election, I think Robert McClelland said something to the effect that we should take an identical view in relation to the Bali bombers, and was quickly hauled into line by Kevin Rudd.
Debbie, is it politicians who we have to look to for protection of human rights or enshrinement of human rights, or can we have faith in the judiciary, say, to do that job for us?
Well, I think part of the dynamic that's at work and what Rob and Julian have just been discussing is a consequence of leaving things only to an operation of political will. And one of the strengths of any system that enshrines a Bill of Rights is that you add another component. You add an independent component. When in a country where you have a strong judiciary, what I don't understand about the opposition to a Bill of Rights is what is everybody afraid of? You have a set of independent, well-qualified and experienced men and women who have worked very hard to get to that position. They swear an oath of office. What's wrong with handing over a bit of power and decision-making to them? That's what I don't understand about the debate.
Let's talk about that, because I believe that Australia has a rather unique position in regards to a Bill of Rights or its absence. How can we possibly explain that if it seems to be so patently, or in theory at least, a good thing? Why does Australia not have one? New Zealand has one.
New Zealand has one, and New Zealand has had one for a long time. And there's a lot of puzzlement across the Tasman about what it is that's taking Australians so long to get about this. I mean, you travel there, the sky hasn't fallen in, there's nothing that operates particularly differently when you leave Auckland Airport to what operates when you leave Tullamarine. But they have a model similar to the one that we have in Victoria, and it works very well.
Or, in fact, the only Western government that doesn't have a Bill of Rights of some description, Canada, the UK, Europe, whereby ourselves in not having a Bill of Rights. And I think it's partly due to the if I may say so, the spineless capitulation of the Labor Party in deferring their Bill of Rights. And that's because Tony Abbott effectively stole the agenda when he spooked Kevin Rudd into deferring the Bill of Rights question.
Is that what it gets back to, Julian?
Well, I think so,
political
yeah.
cowardice?
Yeah. And it really is hard to understand. The problem is not the political cowardice comes from the character of the people who led the charge against it. You know, there were some quite important voices speaking up against the idea of a Charter of Rights for Australia. They had 4 or 5 arguments which were repeated endlessly, and all of which were complete bullshit. It's just that no one was calling them on it, or at least if you tried to call them on it, you didn't get any airtime. It was extraordinary to see such an important measure being defeated by such utterly fallacious arguments advanced by people like Cardinal Pell and Bob Carr and Jim Allen and other people who really ought to know better.
But it's interesting to talk about whether it's political cowardice or whether it's a political recognition of a lack of support in the Australian community. They're not the same thing. I mean, there's kind of 2 ways that you could institute this reform. You can do it either through leadership that is speaking ahead of the community and takes the community with them, or you can talk about recognising that it's a move that the Australian community wants. Now, I'm not really sure which explanation is the better one, whether it is that you've got a sort of a groundswell of support in the Australian community and yet you've got political cowardice.
Deb, we know that Frank Brennan went through an exhaustive consultation process where overwhelmingly the question was in favour of a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And in Victoria went through the same process before its Charter of Rights was enacted.
Yeah, so you say, but you go through that list of things that Julian went through and add to it the intervention. Nobody is getting on the streets every time there is an abuse of human rights. Also, so although you have the Australian community, when they're consulted in a comfortable little meeting room somewhere saying, oh yeah, we think it's a really good idea, every time there's a serious abuse of human rights, where are the people on the streets? They're not there.
I know this is a bit beyond the subject, but I think the problem is this. For at least a couple of decades in Australia, we've had a sort of Jim Hacker approach to parliamentary leadership, which is, I am their leader, I must follow them. The problem is that when that Jim Hacker said that, he meant the public of England. But now, in Australia, the reality is that the they who have to be followed by the parliamentarians are the people who live in the key marginal electorates. There's about maybe 100 or 200,000 people in Australia who are actually setting government policy because they have the good fortune to live in the key marginal electorates where all the news polls and all the focus groups dictate the formation of policy by both major parties.
That's because they've been the beneficiaries of a property boom and they're comfortable.
I'm not so sure, actually. I think the demographics might be a bit different, but let's not go there.
Well, in practical terms, without a Bill of Rights, what are the dangers for Australian citizens?
Well, when John Howard said, trust in the supremacy of Parliament, I knew we were in trouble. I don't trust in the supremacy of Parliament, and I've seen that because of the nature of the work that I've done for various representatives, for instance, of the Tamil community who are raising funds for humanitarian relief, were charged with financing a terrorist organisation, an organisation that in fact had not been prescribed in Australia as a terrorist organisation, yet they were charged. The case collapsed after a 3-year period. But it had the effect of really damaging the Tamil diaspora in Australia, and the humanitarian relief that was being sent to the north of Sri Lanka dried up.
So I think, to a lot of people, perhaps people sitting in this room, a lot of people like me who go home to a comfortable house and things, it doesn't make a difference if we don't have a charter. But it's the people on the margins. It's once you get into the hands of a police officer, once you get, if you happen to be same-sex attracted, if you happen to be different from the comfortable majority, then it matters. And that's like any other exercise of power. It's not to the comfortable majority that it matters, but the exercises of power matter to people who aren't in that comfortable majority.
Interesting. At the big issue, we talk a lot about who we are actually there for. And I get annoyed when I hear people say, oh, the big issue is the magazine sold by homeless people. That's too simplistic. Not all our people are homeless. I was talking to one of the vendors once and I said, well, how would you say we should describe who our people are? And he said, they are people on the margins. And I thought that was a very interesting concept. Are they the people who are most in danger or most at risk of having their human rights abused?
Oh, sure, they can be stopped and strip searched at a railway station, for instance, without any suspicion that they might be carrying any weapon on them. They're the sorts of people who are targeted.
But more broadly, beyond big issue vendors, is this partly a question of class and income? Is it those who have the least who have the most to worry about in terms of human rights abusers?
No, it's not. It's not necessarily a class issue. It's an issue about difference, I think. It's an issue about people who are different from whatever that thing the norm is that people like to... some people want to aspire to, or that we're sold, by the media. It's people who are different.
But
if you have a disability, there are lots of things that are not class sensitive at all, but where you are different in some way, and that's when I think people are more vulnerable.
But if you're different and wealthy, then you're probably not going to have the same problems as if you're different and living on the margins. That's not universally right, but I think broadly you can say that as a generalisation.
And if you're wealthy and you're a Muslim, then you're in trouble as well.
But less than if you're just an ordinary Muslim.
That's true.
Well, that might not be so. I think it really depends on what you're talking about people being vulnerable to, because a person who's wealthy and happens to be a Muslim could be just as easily targeted by a police search as a person that's not. The difference might be who they can hire to defend them, or the resources that they have access to, or who they might be able to talk to ameliorate a problem. So that's definitely
and assert
true.
their rights.
Yeah, that's definitely. So it's a combination of things, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward as a class issue.
We often hear about groups of people. We've heard the term boat people, which is a convenient way of ignoring the fact that these are individuals, all with their own stories. Do you need a big name case, say a Julian Assange, or even a Osama bin Laden or a David Hicks? Do you need big name cases to focus attention on people who aren't known to the broader community? Is it through a WikiLeaks case that you can actually get to the heart of much bigger issues about freedom of speech or the dissemination of information?
I think that's true sometimes. David Hicks is a good example, and Jack Thomas is another good example. The Tampa case focused attention on the plight of refugees.
Not in a way that helped.
No.
Well, it might have changed public consciousness, though, I think.
I think it inflamed public consciousness, actually.
I'm trying to be optimistic there, Julian.
Yeah, I know. I'm naturally optimistic by nature, but and I'm not sure. You see, even the Hicks case didn't do anything to help Hanif. Muhammad Hanif was very interesting. Actually, it sort of I think it illustrates my sort of two-phase point about Australian sentiment. Dr. Hanif was, thrown into custody without charge. He was held for questioning for 14 days or thereabouts, and he was photographed being thrown into a paddy wagon, and he was wearing a Guantanamo-style jumpsuit, and there was a sort of collective sigh of relief across the country as people thought, we're a bit safer because they've locked up a terrorist. Until it turned out that he was absolutely innocent. And then people thought, oh gosh, it's a bad thing to treat someone like that as innocent. If he's presumed innocent, you can do it. If he is innocent, well, then you can't do it. How is it that we justify that sort of attitude with no real difficulty at all? From being a symbol of the terror threat to the symbol of a person who's been badly treated took one day.
It's interesting because I think one of the turning points in the Hanif case was when the unofficial journal of the Australian Federal Police, that's the Australian newspaper, turned against the AFP and promoted Hanif's innocence. I think that was actually a turning point.
Yeah, it was.
And so once you get the broader community through the media perhaps behind behind you. I think it happened to a degree in Jack Thomas. He's now seen as an inconsequential figure. He's not now seen as Osama bin Laden's white boy in Australia. I think when the tide turns, and sometimes through the media, that's an important thing.
Well, often through the media. I mean, the sad fact is many people are dependent on the media to understand the issues behind some of these things, and until the media takes some responsibility for telling the stories in a more even-handed way, and as you say, humanising some of these things, and starting to talk about these, if you take so-called boat people as an example, starting to talk about them as mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and people that have left families behind, and people that have children halfway around the world and they don't know what's happened to them. Of course, you can't identify them, and I think that's one of the real problems often with asylum seekers. You can't give them a name. There are all these laws that have been, one might say, cynically designed to dehumanise these people, so that when their cases go through the courts, you can't give them a name. But I do think that there's more need for the media to start looking at these people as individuals, and I think that helps.
On the other hand, it's difficult to achieve that because it depends on what agendas the papers are running. For years, I completely agree with your view, but for years I tried to get the press to see and speak of boat people as real human beings who had desperate stories to tell, and it just didn't work. You couldn't get anything about refugees in the newspaper that was favourable. What you got was coverage of riots at Woomera and all lip sewing on Nauru and all this and that's not a good look. And then the tide turned somewhere around about 2005 or 2006 perhaps, and you couldn't open a paper without seeing good news stories about refugees. It was all very heartening. But of course that was when they weren't coming. We were being perfectly generous and open-hearted to them as long as they didn't come. And when they started coming again, you get all the bad coverage about them coming back. So, what bit of it did we forget?
And yet, when there's a catastrophe off Christmas Island and people are in danger, locals are doing what they can to help them. So there's this weird thing happening.
But you know what that is? That's because they're there. And Australians are good-hearted people. And what they're then seeing right in front of their eyes is another human being in trouble.
Yeah.
And Australians have no difficulty responding to that. It's the minute that you disengage people from that immediate connection that you allow this kind of general prejudice. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about boat people, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about same-sex attracted people, whoever you're talking about, the minute you disengage from that personal connection, you allow the stereotyping to get in, I think.
So before we head to questions from the audience, just one last thing from me. We've talked about the media, the role they should play. Does a lot of it get back to lawyers, or should this be an issue not to be handled by lawyers?
Well, no, you need a groundswell of public opinion, and David Hicks is the best example of that. It took 5 years, but when the community said, well, how can you keep a person unconvicted in those circumstances in Guantanamo Bay for 5 years while every other Western government was repatriating its people from Guantanamo Bay, then things changed. That both political parties really came on board at that point.
No, you need lawyers. I mean, let's defend them for a moment, seeing there's three of us sitting up here. Lawyers that work in this area do it because they believe in the rule of law, and they believe in the power of that and in the power of an independent judiciary. And so there is a real role for them, and there's a real role for the judiciary, and those are the kinds of checks and balances that keep our democracy working. I don't understand why our government's so afraid of that.
I agree, but I think it's important that human rights shouldn't be seen as the province of lawyers. I mean, lawyers do have an important role to play in protecting human rights, but every member of the community has an important role to play in protecting human rights by being aware of them, by being concerned when they learn of people's human rights being breached. Don't wait until it's your turn to have your human rights breached. Be concerned about breaches of human rights anywhere. I wish people didn't think this was all just about lawyers, because in a sense that way you can pass off the responsibility and say, oh, let the lawyers look after it, it's their game. So I do think, whilst we have a role to play, so have you, every one of you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely.
I think the role of lawyers has changed a bit as well, Alan. I think we no longer sit back and allow, in high-profile cases, a contamination of public opinion. And we see in all the terrorism cases there's overstatement, embellishment, exaggeration when people are arrested, when the authorities talk about, for instance, iconic landmarks being identified and threatened, and the truth of the matter is it never eventuates, and it never was going to eventuate. So our role, certainly as solicitors, has changed to some degree. We're much more on the offensive, but we can't achieve things without broader community support.
But is it up to the community then to lean on the politicians for them to provide some kind of leadership? Or is that too much to hope?
It's essential because, frankly, there's not enough lawyers in Australia to make any electoral difference. It's got to be the public. It's got to be the politicians will do what the majority of the public want, especially if you live in marginal electorates.
Okay. All right. Well, let's open it up to questions. I believe there are some microphones around, and
I don't need a microphone.
well, no, we do need a microphone. And can I please make it clear we want questions, not statements. And as a long-time journalist, I know the difference between a question and a statement, and I will ruthlessly cut off the statement makers.
Yes, I have a question about the media, because I think...
When you ask your question, can you just make it clear if you're addressing one of the panellists or as a general question? Thank you.
As a general question, I'm sorry. My concern is, amongst the radio side of the media, there is a point where a balanced view has got to be put. Not all radio stations, particularly New South Wales stations, adhere to that, but I would like to see some way they could be made to adhere to it. And is it possible that that could be extended to newspapers?
Well, I mean, I think there ought to be balanced views put, and we ought to have as an informed public as we can, and that doesn't occur with the shock jocks in Sydney and in Melbourne to a lesser degree, and in the media. It seems that there's no appetite for a balanced view in the tabloid media at any event.
Well, we come back to what people want to listen to. I mean, this is, I think, part of those shock jocks would have no currency if they weren't getting the ratings. The sad comment is that they're getting the ratings. Now, what does that tell us about what, large parts of the Australian community want to listen to? So somewhere, rather than perhaps trying to regulate those people, as Julian says, it comes back to trying to change the hearts and minds of ordinary Australians so that they switch their radios off those stations.
By the big issue.
As a media representative, I should say, I think, that one of the things that's happening is that so much media now is instant. Things that were once held for the next morning's newspapers are now going up online at once, which means the opportunity to get, on the one hand, on the other hand, views, it's becoming more difficult. But next question.
I have a general question. I recently learnt that it costs $53,000 to get 60 minutes of footage of asylum seekers being transported. Is that obvious lack of transparency unconstitutional under our current Australian Constitution? And would it take a Bill of Rights for us to allege or to take a case against the government that they are abusing human rights in that context?
Well, one of the strengths of having a Bill of Rights of some kind that you can take to a court is that you immediately increase transparency, because no part of the executive government is immune from having to answer a case against it in court. So the minute you can get a case into court, you improve transparency. That, I think, is one of the great things about a Bill of Rights. Not the only, but I think it's one of them.
Debbie, weren't you... You said something backstage before we started that suggested you've got some concerns about the so-called Malaysian solution and how that might work in practice. The idea of moving people somewhere else quite separately.
Oh, well, that's a long list of concerns. But if I start with a couple. The first is that it's just it's an abdication of Australia's responsibilities under the Refugee Protocol. In terms of numbers, Australia has a very small number of asylum seekers who manage to get here. You compare it to a lot of countries in Africa and in Europe, I mean, we get a minuscule number of people. We should be able to take our protection obligations seriously, and we ought to be able to assess those people in Australia without shipping them off as if they're cattle to another country.
And Debbie, do you think it's akin to something like transportation?
Well, there are lots of analogies you could make. I think Julian was making another one backstage as well. I mean,
Human trafficking.
It's disgraceful. Yeah. It's really disgraceful. When you think about the resources this country has, it has a strong asylum seeker processing system. It's, for all the things we might criticise about it, it's a system that adheres to the fundamentals of the Refugees Convention. We can do it here. The people deserve protection. We're able to protect them. Why do we need to engage with another country about it?
Question right up the back there. Oh, sorry, yes.
A very quick one. I would like to ask about your language policies and approach to our multilingual society that we have turned into. As we see here, everyone is English speaking. And what I wanted to ask you, are there any authorities that are looking at provision, say, of interpreters, of media being multilingual and accessing through the media the wider population who were ex-refugees, who are now Australians, but by their virtue of hard work do not have English skills? I work as interpreter, and I see these people every day in courts told, plead guilty, because it will be quick way out of this system. And 3/4 of them that I interpret for plead guilty in courts just to get their cases out. So what I would like to ask, is there any way to ensure that we have languages catered for?
I thought our courts did pretty well in providing interpreting services. And anyone who works with SBS would be a bit upset by the premise in your question that there's no multilingual media. There are plenty of multilingual newspapers in Australia, and SBS does a great job, I think, addressing people who speak languages other than English. Now, I speak English, and I'm no longer fluent in other languages, so I don't know how well we're doing that, but it's upsetting to hear that you're critical of it.
It's a tragic situation because a lot of people who do not speak the language have absolutely no access to justice.
Yeah, mind you, there are a lot of people who, for lack of resources, have no access to justice, and legal aid is so abysmally underfunded that people who can't afford lawyers may not get legal aid either, and so they go along and they're, let's face it, in court we speak a foreign language, so even an English speaker is at a disadvantage in a court.
I thought they should have an interpreter as well.
Yeah. I've certainly seen it in the mainstream media, not before time. Major news organisations have worked out it just makes common sense to have on staff a variety of people who speak different languages because, as we all know, stories happen all over the world and to all kinds of different people. So, next question.
Yeah, this is a general question. I'm just wondering, considering the Aboriginal intervention, is there any linkage between land rights and human rights? Aboriginal land rights, that is.
Oh, fundamental. I mean, it may not, in terms, be land rights may not, in terms, be a right that's recognised. There's a lot of debate about that, particularly when you're talking about communal native title. But to Indigenous people, it's the first, I would think, and the most important kind of human right that you recognise people's custodianship of the land in which they've been for generations. So absolutely there's a connection.
Well, is the land right issue one of the reasons why a Bill of Rights is not pushed by, say, the Liberal Party?
No, I don't think so, because The list of rights, for example, in the Victorian Charter and in the ACT's Human Rights Act, are concerned with civil and political rights, not with cultural, social and economic rights. If you started to include cultural, social and economic rights, then you might find those two things coming together, and I can understand that there will be people who would argue against extending the rights that far. But at the moment, we're only concerned with civil and political rights. Incidentally, Debbie is exactly right. The key judgment in Mabo was Justice Brennan's judgment, and in that he explicitly drew the connection between the basic humanity of Aborigines and the importance of their connection to the land. It really wasn't couched in the language of human rights, but it was all about human rights.
Can I just add, though, in terms of what's happening in Victoria right now, our Charter of Human Rights is under review by the state government. One of the key terms of the review that they will be looking at, and that I encourage you all to inform yourself about, is whether the right to self-determination should be added to this charter. And so that, whether that fits comfortably as a civil and political right or an economic, social and cultural right, you know, that's something for lawyers to debate. But the thing is that it's actively under consideration, and it seems to me that it's the one important right that is missing from our charter, and it's perhaps something that took a little bit of a back seat in the federal debate as well.
I think the Attorney General's Department's accepting submissions at the moment about the future of the charter.
Yep.
Until the 10th of June.
Next up.
There is someone right at the back who's had their hand up for a long time.
Yes.
My question's for Julian and Debbie. I've volunteered for about 8 years at an organisation that assists asylum seekers, and I'm very concerned about the federal government's policies regarding asylum seekers at the moment and their lack of respect of human rights for asylum seekers. Apart from lobby the politicians, what can the average person do?
On the ground, I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking about when you're talking about asylum seekers. For those people who are locked up on Christmas Island or in Curtin, there's not a lot that a person who resides in Victoria can do, perhaps other than give money to people that are actively up there supporting. But if you talk about asylum seekers, you're also talking about lots of people that are living in our community, sometimes living on visas that don't entitle them to work. And there are plenty of people walking around the streets of Melbourne who are in that situation, who are not entitled to work and are dependent on charity to be able to survive. Now, those are the kinds of people that are assisted perhaps by the sorts of volunteer organisations that you've been working with. But in terms of assisting one-on-one, there's plenty of things that you can do about that. And the next thing you do is then you talk to every single person you know about those people you meet and about your experiences with them. And that's how you encourage, slowly I think but surely, a change in community attitudes to those kinds of people.
I agree.
Next question, in the middle there, and I think you're next, sir.
I wanted to speak about enforcement. I guess the shining light has always been the European Court of Human Rights, and I was recently reading that there's quite a lot of backlash against decisions, especially ones that are very intrusive in people's lives and sovereignty, etc. And then we have our model, which is considered somewhat toothless, relatively, I guess. Is there a happy medium, and do you think that we need to do more, or there's some sort of way to resolve those two issues?
It's a really good point and a very difficult problem. I think given the lack of sophistication of Australian attitudes to charters of rights, it was probably a good idea to come in with a fairly weak model, which we have here and which they have in the ACT, because it doesn't frighten the politicians and it doesn't frighten the public so much. I would hope that in the course of a decade or two, the existence of the Charter will gradually educate the public to the importance of human rights and get them used to the idea that, as Debbie said, the sky hasn't fallen in. You fly into Canberra and it's still like it's always been, more or less. and there hasn't been a lawyer's feast, and you know, all the dread that's been stirred up about it doesn't come true. And if people get accustomed to the idea that protecting human rights doesn't actually do any harm, then they may be prepared to give the government a mandate to strengthen the protection which is offered. And of course, that's the sort of two-step process which happened in Canada. And I suspect that we could probably manage that in Australia, but we have to take the first big step and acknowledge that at federal level, where most, or at least many, human rights abuses come from, we need at least a weak model for protection. One of the most depressing things, and I'm sure Debbie can tell you many stories about this, one of the most depressing things is that if you're arguing a case that's about human rights in its fundamentals, in the federal judicial system, you can't talk about human rights because they're legally irrelevant. What you have to do is find some other legal device and talk about that. And it always strikes me as desperately uncomfortable when what you're trying to do is to protect human rights, but you've got to talk about some weird legal animal that is actually recognised by the law.
Well, funnily enough, if I may say so, in the Ben Breaky case, which was the prosecution of the 12 Muslim men, Justice Bongiorno, without applying the Charter, said that the conditions that those 12 unconvicted people were remanded into, that's at the Acacia prison in Geelong, shackled, manacled, 23-hour lockup, was so intolerable for someone who was unconvicted that he forced the Office of Corrections to change their custodial setting so that they were put into a mainstream prison. So without applying the Charter, Justice Bongiorno said these people have fundamental human rights that need to be protected. So I think it does have an impact. And although it's relatively toothless, at least the courts are trying to understand the principles and apply them as best they can.
Yeah, as Julian says, it changes the universe in which you have the discussion. Because you then have the discussion in a rights-based universe, and that, irrespective of whether a court actually ends up applying it, or even, as you say, if it's not as strong a model as some of the European models, you are in a different universe in the way that you're talking about people's rights and responsibilities towards other people. And I think that's the shift that a Bill of Rights can make.
And the soft entry with a weak model gives you something which we've seen elsewhere in anti-discrimination legislation. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that when I was going to university, you never saw a woman driving a tram. There wasn't a law against it, but there was just a prevailing sentiment that women couldn't drive trams because they're poor, weak creatures. And then, this was in the late 60s, and then there was Germaine Greer and the whole feminist movement, and then equal opportunity legislation, anti-discrimination legislation came in. And after a while, people stopped thinking. Although there was a law that forbade discrimination, I doubt that you could meet anyone in Melbourne today who would say to you that women shouldn't drive trams. It's just wiped out that underlying sentiment. And a law that educates and produces a result without having to be enforced every day is probably the ideal that we can have. I think public education and public feelings about these things are really vital, and a charter helps it along.
I think we have time for two more questions. Is the first one teed up? I think.
This gentleman's had his hand up.
Just as a lawyer myself, I think in relation to something Julian just said, of course, all law involves shoehorning reality into bizarre legal doctrines to a certain extent, I think. Partly the question, I think my question has just been answered, which is really what can be done? There are many people here who are all in violent agreement, and yet we've heard there's a lack of sophistication. We've heard that it affects people at the margins. We've heard pessimism about the bracket creep of authoritarianism and the removal of rights. So what are the options? We've talked, Julian's mentioned education through changing law through weak law, but ultimately aren't we having a debate about the values that the society is based on? Can we really have that debate in small little bits and pieces and hope that it catches up on people without them really noticing? Or is it a debate that has to be had at a broad level, bravely and openly?
Both. Both. And the important thing is to keep on pressing and keep on, as Debbie says, speak to everyone you know. Make sure you can have a civilised discussion with people who disagree with you and try and show them why it is that we need to change. And don't worry about it. It's a long process. It's not going to change overnight. But if you get depressed about that, remember William Wilberforce, who took, about 3 decades before he got English society to recognise that maybe slavery wasn't such a hot idea. These things may take time, but it's worth pursuing.
Yes, and ignore the old adage about not discussing politics and religion over the dinner table. I mean, that's the thing. We've got to start talking to those with whom we disagree. We've got to start having civilised conversations, not just with those who share our views, but with those who don't, and have them both privately and publicly. And one of the things that I think tends to happen is that those who are opposed to a stronger human rights regime have the loudest voices. They have the loudest voices privately and they have the loudest voices publicly, and that needs to change.
I agree with that.
Last question. Do we have one lined up? Who?
Yes, please. The guy on the left there has been...
Okay. Do you think that human rights are culturally neutral? Could you apply the same human rights charter?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you think that human rights are culturally neutral?
Culturally neutral?
I mean, could you apply the same bill anywhere in the world?
I'm not sure why you're asking, actually, because we're not trying to do that, but broadly speaking, I think the answer is probably yes. But you may get somewhat different outcomes on the same provisions in different cultures, because many of the provisions are normative, and so they will apply differently in cultures with different norms.
I'd like to hear Deb's view on religion and human rights and how she might think it impacts and how they might coincide.
I think it's hard to say that all human rights are sort of capable of being introduced in a culturally neutral way in all countries. And I think that doesn't pay sufficient respect to cultural differences. I do. But there are some things that are not negotiable, and a lot of the civil and political rights and the key economic, social and cultural rights, health, education and housing, I mean, those kinds of things ought to be available irrespective of the culture that you're in. But there are ways that culturally strong nations, and I'm thinking here, I do a bit of work in Samoa. Now that's culturally a very strong nation. It's culturally religiously it's a very Christian nation, but yet they have an entrenched Bill of Rights. They've had an entrenched Bill of Rights in their constitution since 1961, and in a culturally and religiously conservative country they seem to operate perfectly well.
In a country with diverse religious backgrounds, you haven't answered the question, Deb.
I think there's a fundamental problem that people are not addressing about Bills of Rights in terms of how a public debate about how you marry freedom of religion with other civil and political rights, and I think that's a debate that people are a little bit scared to have, and we have to get over that.